Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Chris Pelton, the STARS Program Manager with ASHE, and I'll be the moderator today. We're happy to have you all with us for the next hour. So as many of you know, ASHE's mission is to inspire and catalyze higher education to lead the global sustainability transformation. We're an international association with about 1,000 members spread across more than 20 countries. We serve as the professional home for campus sustainability staff, but we offer resources for everyone in higher ed, faculty, students, staff, administrators, as well as the businesses and nonprofits that work with campuses. We provide an expansive collection of online resources, networking tools, and educational events such as today's webinar, and an annual conference and expo, which was held in Pittsburgh at the beginning of October. ASHE 2019 will take place October 27th through 30th next year in Spokane, Washington. So we hope to see you all there. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Everyone in the audience is on mute, but please feel free to ask questions or provide comments at any point during the presentation. You can do that by typing your questions or comments into the questions pane in the control panel on your screen. If you have additional questions that we don't get to, please email them to education@ashe.org and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. In addition, at the end of the webinar, you'll have an opportunity to provide feedback about today's presentation. We take your suggestions into account when planning future webinars, so please do provide the feedback if you get a chance. Please also note the webinar is being recorded. If you experience technical difficulties or have to leave early, you and others can view the recording later on. The recording and the presentation materials will all be uploaded to the ASHE's Campus Sustainability Hub after the live broadcast and available tomorrow. So today's webinar is Just Labeling Stars, Comparison and Synergies. And we're fortunate to have with us today Francis James, the Just Manager at the International Living Future Institute. Francis works with organizations worldwide to support their efforts to become more socially just, equitable, and inclusive. Francis also helps organizations through the process of developing progressive policies, programs, and practices that lead to more engaged, happier, and more productive workplaces. So before I turn things over to Francis, I thought I would share a quick overview of STARS for those of you who may not be familiar with the program. And then following Francis's presentation about JUST, I'll review some of the linkages between the two frameworks, and then we'll save some time at the end for Q&A. So STARS is the Sustainability Tracking, Assessment, and Rating System. It's a transparent, self-reporting framework for colleges and universities to measure their sustainability performance. ASHE developed STARS with broad participation from diverse sectors of higher education and the campus sustainability community, launching the very first version of STARS in 2010. Early 2019, we'll be releasing the next version of STARS, version 2.2. So it's a framework that's always evolving and responding to our sort of collective knowledge about what the major sustainability challenges are and how higher education institutions can best address them. At this stage, STARS is the most widely recognized standard for higher ed sustainability in the world. We have 328 rated institutions at the moment, and more than 900 colleges and universities in 37 countries are using the online STARS reporting tool. STARS is based on credits that participants can pursue to earn points and ultimately receive a rating. The credits are organized into 4 main categories you see here: academics, engagement, operations, and planning and administration, and then 17 nested subcategories or impact areas. There's also an optional innovation and leadership category through which institutions can earn bonus points. So as you can see, STARS is a comprehensive sustainability framework covering teaching and learning, community engagement, greening campus operations, diversity, social justice, and more. Ultimately, the points earned pursuing STARS credits determine an institution's STARS rating. So there are 4 ratings available: platinum, gold, silver, and bronze. An institution that doesn't want to pursue a rating or make its scores public can still participate and earn recognition as a STARS reporter. STARS data and scores also contribute to other prominent higher ed ranking systems, such as the Princeton Review's Guide to Green Colleges and Sierra Magazine's annual Cool Schools ranking. STARS participants can also compare and benchmark their performance using STARS data displays and a soon-to-be-released STARS benchmarking tool, as shown here. So with that, I'll turn things over to Francis for an introduction to the JUST label. Welcome, Francis.
Chris, is that showing up?
It is, yeah.
Great. Hello, everyone. This is Francis James. I'm the program manager at the International Living Future Institute. We are a 501c3 not-for-profit organization headquartered in Seattle, Washington, with staff distributed across the United States of America. And when you, let's see here, get moving here. The mission of the Living Future Institute is to help lead transformation of communities that are socially just, culturally rich, and ecologically restorative. The International Living Future Institute is best known for its flagship program, the Living Building Challenge, which was launched in the public domain roughly 2006, and it's considered the most robust, rigorous, and holistic green building standard in the world. Over the past 4 years, we've introduced the Living Community Challenge, which looks at living buildings at a community or campus scale, and many universities and colleges in North America are actually reviewing this particular paradigm as we speak. The Living Product Challenge has worked with manufacturers to help them develop new products that have a net positive and social impact to society. So we have a vision where we want to make this world work for all of us in the shortest time possible without ecological offense or to the disadvantage of anyone. That's where we actually try to create a more equitable world together. As we mentioned, the Living Building Challenge started as version 1.0 in roughly 2006. It's evolved over time to meet the needs of a rapidly changing world. And in terms of its holistic structure and paradigm, if you're working in green building standard today, we clearly need to focus on issues like water, energy, materials. We call these petals within the Living Building Challenge paradigm. But because it's a holistic look at sustainability, we care about site or place, human health and happiness, equity, and beauty. So when we dive into the framework, we have what we call subpetals or imperatives. You can see here for the various different petals, there's some additional what we call imperatives. Within the equity petal, there are 4 specific imperatives. Imperative 18 is called just organizations. So in practice, if one of your institutions were interested in developing and constructing a living building project, then one of the project team members must have earned the JUST label for that project to be fully certified. It could be the campus itself, it could be the architect of record, it could be one of the consultants or one of the engineers or the contractor. A few years ago, the U.S. Green Building Council wanted to pay more attention to the concept of social equity within the built environment, and they have accepted JUST as a compliance pathway to earning innovation credit. And if you look at their website for new construction, if you have a project team member with the JUST label, they can apply for one possible credit within LEED v4. Some of you may be familiar or working within the WELL building standard, sort of a human-focused or human-centric green building standard. JUST is integrated into the MIND category of the WELL building standard. And if you were to go to the WELL building site, you'll see that requirement number 98 is called organizational transparency. And having the JUST label allows that organization wishing to apply for WELL to achieve that particular requirement. Specifically, they say that organizations that espouse fair, equitable, and just treatment towards their workforce help create a culture of reduced stress, greater employee satisfaction, as well as a heightened sense of loyalty. So when we characterize or position, what a just organization might look like, certainly these are some of the descriptors that we would use. It's an ethical leadership. There's inclusive treatment of the workforce. It's definitely a safe, a healthy working environment. Employees themselves are engaged day to day in their place of work. There's high levels of trust within the organizational culture, and the organization, institution, or corporation has deep ties and connections to the communities that it participates in and supports. At a high level, we certainly would say that the JUST program goals would be to help organizations improve overall their existing body of HR policies, programs, and practices. So in fact, that we do make work better for the employees and workforce. And we feel now that there's in fact a common framework and sort of languaging that we can use to discuss and measure social equity in the workplace. So once the organization goes through the JUST process, you actually in fact earn the JUST label. You can see that on the right-hand side of the screen. This is a transparency platform and disclosure tool. Organizations are sharing with the JUST program policy statements and associated data. At the end of that journey, you will earn essentially what we call the equivalent of an attrition label for socially responsible institutions and organizations. We feel that organizations wanting to lead on social justice issues, JUST is one helpful mechanism to allow that to take place. So when you sort of look at the label, there's the 21 indicators and there's little check boxes attached to each of the indicators. And we would characterize sort of each of the boxes as 1 box checked off is good, 2 is better, 3 is best. The program has some flexibility. So for some instance, you may not have any information to share across some indicators, and you have an opt-out scenario of a maximum of 3 indicators, but no more than 1 indicator per category. So for instance, you could not opt out of both indicators in the safety category, for example. It is not a performance-based program or paradigm. As long as you're transparent with us and give us a minimum of 19 out of the 21 indicators, you're able to earn the JUST label. So we're just going to quickly at high level discuss some of the indicators across the 6 categories. We have diversity to lead the JUST program. There's 3 indicators we talk about or look at, explore non-discrimination policies. We look at the ethnic, racial diversity and the gender diversity of the workforce. Equity, there's 6 indicators. We explore issues, priorities around full-time employment. We look at what we call pay scale equity in organizations, ratio between highest and lowest paid employee. We have a concept called union/employee friendly, rights of employees to self-organize if they so choose to. We have a indicator that talks about living wage. We ask organizations to spend time to look at whether they have gender pay parity. We want organizations to look through their paid family leave programs. The safety category looks at having policies and practices to ensure the safety and well-being of your workforce, and especially insofar you might deal with hazardous and volatile chemicals. In the worker benefit category, we want organizations to have an explicit focus on ensuring that you're working consistently toward high levels of worker happiness and engagement. We want employers to ensure that they're offering a comprehensive benefits package, including medical, dental, and vision. In a complex, rapidly changing global economy, it also makes sense for organizations to continue to incentivize their workforce to take advantage of continuing education opportunities. The local benefit category looks in terms of where the leadership or ownership of that said organization, where they reside in terms of relative to the place of operations. We want organizations to commit to spending a portion of their procurement dollars for operational goods and services with small, local, independent businesses. We feel that there's a strong social equity advantage to that particular priority. And with the last category, we have another 6 indicators. Responsible investing, insofar as the institution has excess liquidity and puts those dollars into investment instruments, does the organization have a socially responsible practice associated with that. We want to encourage organizations to give their employees time off to volunteer in community groups and not-for-profits of their choosing. For positive products, we want organizations to think comprehensively whether the services and products they deliver to the community and society as a whole have beneficial aspects to that process. And the final three indicators revolve around charitable giving. Does the organization have a formal practice of giving to charitable groups in their community? We want organizations to think around the concept of animal welfare, whether you have engagement or contact with animals, whether there's compassionate, humane practices in place through those activities. And transparency, we want organizations to be fully and ethically transparent about all aspects of their operation and governance and what they deliver in terms of products and services to their stakeholders. So we're going to move through and just look at a few of these categories, indicators in terms of research that suggests why it's important to focus on some of these aspects. When we talk about diversity within the JUST framework, we lead with gender and race/ethnicity, but as you can see from this color wheel, it does give you more well-rounded and also a much more nuanced look at diversity as an issue, right? It's a complex issue, and you can see these different characteristics will allow a member of a leadership team or within human resources to think through, are we as diverse as the communities that we serve? When we look at specifically the issue of gender diversity, certainly within the Standard & Poor's, the largest publicly traded companies in the United States context, you can see today that women are participating in these larger companies at about 44–45% of the overall workforce, and then compares favorably to overall women's representation in the US workforce, about 47–48%. But clearly, as you move up the pyramid to more senior levels of responsibility, the numbers dwindle or the ratio gets smaller. And in 2017, of the 500 S&P companies, only 6% of those organizations, in fact, are led by a female executive. McKinsey & Company, an organization that's highly respected as a management firm, did this sort of what we call corporate pipeline assessment, and this is probably applicable to large institutions as well, but across 132 larger organizations in North America. And you can see that at the entry level, women and men participate at roughly their percentages in the overall population. But you can see that for women in particular, that pipeline diminishes as you move up to more senior levels of responsibility, and especially now at the C-suite, right, for CFOs, CIOs, CTOs, right, that percentage diminishes to only 20% of their overall talent in the C-suite. And for women of color, it dramatically diminishes from entry level of 17 to only 3% at the C-suite level. So within the United States, we've been sort of looking at the demographics and the projections of for the labor force. And in 2010, when the Census Bureau sort of looked at the demographics of the available workforce, people of color were represented at roughly 34%. And they're doing a projection now going forward about 4 decades, 40 years. And you can see here in the year 2050, US Census Bureau predicts or projects that people of color, in terms of their overall percentage of the available talent pool or labor force, will be closer to 55%. So there's strong research and data that suggests that there's a business case for having diversity at all levels of the organization. The Gallup survey people gives us this sort of graphic that suggests that there's high levels of disengagement overall across all institutions, organizations, and businesses. But insofar as either a male employee or a female employee has a female supervisor or manager, statistically, it's more likely that they're feeling better about their workplace and they're more engaged, 4% more likely in either scenario. So Ernst & Young, again, a highly respected management consulting firm, did this pretty large survey of 22,000 publicly traded global entities across 90 countries, across various sectors and industries. And their bottom line report is that when you have at least 30% of women taking responsibility in senior leadership roles, it can potentially add up to 6% more to the net profit margin. So this is a pretty large data set, and they're pretty clear in terms of having gender diversity in senior roles can drive bottom line performance. McKinsey and Company, again, suggests that within the context of the United States, for business entities, that there's a linear relationship between racial diversity and superior financial performance. Specifically, what they're saying is that for every 10% increase in racial ethnic diversity on senior leadership team, earnings before interest and taxes rise 1%. So they're saying there's a strong linkage between these two outcomes. So there are other reports, other surveys, other information suggests that diversity has some important aspects in terms of, especially if you're trying to recruit millennial talent. Multiple surveys suggest that diversity is particularly important to this cohort. We feel that by committing to diversity as a strategic imperative, institutions, businesses, corporations are better positioned to meet the needs of a multicultural constituency. Many surveys suggest that diverse workplaces and inclusive HR practices and programs increases employee satisfaction and fosters better attitudes in the workplace. And we know that when you have diverse work teams, it does foster innovation and creativity by bringing a diversity of perspectives, fresher thinking ideas, and approaches to research. Really, this slide here kind of summarizes the extent of the research in terms of having why it's compelling to have diverse organizations, right? Certainly from a recruitment and retention and employee perspective, more adaptability, but more creativity, innovation, higher levels of stakeholder satisfaction. And you saw earlier there's statistics around financial performance. So this is really the summary statement of why diversity matters. Now, exploring the issue of gender pay equity, Time magazine a few years ago had produced this graphic showing that the gender pay gap exists worldwide. It's a worldwide phenomena. And there happens to be only a handful of countries that actually have relatively modest gender pay gaps, 10% or less. And it happens to be Norway, Poland, Spain, and New Zealand. All the countries typically are 10% or higher. The American Association of University Women have done a lot of sort of research and assessment of the data in the United States context. In the United States, the gender pay gap is estimated to be in about 20 to 21% overall. But they have broken it down in 2015 by race and ethnicity. And for African American women in the United States, the gender pay gap is closer probably to 37 to 38%. And for Hispanic women, the pay gap is closer to 47 to 48%. We can actually break down the gender pay gap by age. So for men and women just entering the workforce, either after high school or graduating from university and colleges, the gender pay gap already starts out at 10%. But certainly for women's peak earning years, the gender pay gap is closer to what we see as the overall average. This graphic here shows you that the gender pay gap exists across all educational attainment levels. Unfortunately, even when women invest the time, energy, resources, and dollars to achieve advanced degrees, it doesn't necessarily slow down or diminish the pay gap by significant numbers. Moving over to the issue of what we call the family-friendly indicator, or the ability of organization to provide paid family and medical leave. This particular graphic shows that worldwide, there are very few countries that do not offer a national uniform standard of offering paid maternity leave. It happens there only be maybe potentially 3 or 4 countries worldwide that does not do that, including the United States of America. This mapping here gives you a sampling of what the typical durations or leave programs available by country. For certainly a lot of the European, Scandinavian countries, we're seeing paid maternity leave programs of 30 plus weeks. And our neighbors to the north of us here in Canada The program is very, very generous, up potentially 50 weeks to either moms or dads. And what's interesting when you look at the research is that for the vast majority of OECD countries, having a national program of paid maternity leave has been well established. Certainly Norway put their program in place over a century ago. Germany established their program in 1911. 2 years after the end of World War II, Japan implemented their program. Our Canadian friends implemented this program in 1971. So essentially for all OECD countries, paid maternity as a national offering was available prior to the 1980s. In the United States, many of you may know that the standard program that's available is called the Family and Medical Leave Act, but because this is only applicable to organizations that have 50 employees or more, it means that there's a large grouping of employees in the United States that are ineligible to take advantage of FMLA, up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave. But because it's unpaid leave and is relatively unattractive, right? In 2011, when we looked at the data, only 16% of eligible FMLA covered workers, in fact, took leave. So what that means in practice is, of course, is that it means that states, certain jurisdictions and individual institutions, organizations have to provide benefits if they're capable of doing so. We have some specific case studies here. IKEA last year decided that they wanted to have a pretty generous program. If you've been with them for at least a year, you're able to get 6 weeks of leave at full pay, followed by another 6 weeks at half pay. If you stay a little bit longer, that program becomes more generous. Johnson & Johnson is a global pharmaceutical supply company. A couple of years ago, they decided to double the length of the program to 18 weeks of leave at 100% of pay. Fathers are also incentivized to take leave as well. American Express has a very generous gender-neutral program, 20 weeks of leave at 100% of pay. Birth mothers can take additional leave if they so need to, at the advice of their health practitioner. I did a little bit of research in terms of for higher education in the United States context. You can see here some of the sampling of leaves across the United States. In Texas A&M, at this point in time, does not offer a particular paid leave program. They're reliant or compliant to FMLA. So the reason why essentially the entire planet, globe, all nations are doing some kind of national programs is they realize that there's positive outcomes to their citizens. Lower infant mortality rates, improvement of parent-child bonds, better long-term health outcomes for the children who are able to bond with their parents in their initial phases of their life, and there are reported lower rates of postpartum depression. We'll look here at the indicator around union/employee friendly. And when you sort of inquire about who do you imagine are actually unionized workers in our society, oftentimes we think it's people working in the trades, whether it's a plumbing union, electrical union. The reality is shown on the right-hand side of this graphic, right? Almost 1/2 of union members, in fact, are female. Almost more than a third are people of color. Over 40% actually have a bachelor's degree. 40% work in the health services or educational sector. And this is an interesting graphic produced by the Economic Policy Institute. And you can see here for over a century what the percentages of workers overall in terms of who are unionized. It kind of peaked, right, in the 1945 to the 1960 era. We had a lot of robust manufacturing happening, specifically in the United States, and that's tend to taper over time. You can see how that correlates to the share of overall income going to the top 10% of income earners. That's those two curves that diverged over time. This graphic here from The Nation magazine gives another perspective that they say that in 1955, unionization peaked at 30%. As of last year, that number had dwindled to only 11% of all workers. Unions win higher wages for the workers, anywhere from, according to The Nation, 10 to 20%. And people of color people of color do benefit dramatically from participating in union organizations. This is another take on terms of what the benefits in terms of compensation are to workers. For those in the private sector, it's on average a 6% higher pay. For those in the public sectors, the number is even more dramatic. And for young people coming into the workforce and are part of a union organization, that pay is significantly higher at 38% on average more. So Albert Einstein was a charter member of a union in Princeton University. In 1938, he commented that he considered it important, indeed urgently necessary, for workers to get together, both to protect their own economic status and to secure their influence in the political arena. We're going to spend a little bit of time looking at the concept of income and wealth inequality. And we have tracked real median household income by race, ethnicity in the United States for about 50 years. You can see here that as of 2013, Asian American households had the highest median income at roughly $67,000. And for African American and Native American families, their median income shows up at roughly $34,000. We've also are able to track now for a century the average real income for the top 1% of income earners. And you can see that in roughly 1980, it was like a switch was flipped on and their incomes rose dramatically. For the bottom 90% income earners, not much has changed over a long period of time. And when we look specifically at the earnings of CEOs and workers for the 350 largest publicly owned companies in the United States, looking back at 1965 as a snapshot in time, those CEOs on average earned about $800,000. The average worker earned about $40,000. So that ratio between highest compensated and the average worker was about 20 to 1. Now, fast forward to the year 2013, a few years ago, those same CEOs now, total compensation would be about $15 million, average worker compensation of roughly $52,000. Now, ratios balloon from 20 to a ratio of now almost, well, essentially 300 to 1. And this is just a snapshot in time of what that's looked like for pay rates of CEOs versus average workers. And then when you look at it worldwide, you can make a realistic argument that CEOs in other countries should also be paid, at pretty high levels to attract, really top talent. And they are facing similar challenges, but nowhere that we see in terms of research for other industrialized Western countries that those ratios are as high as what we see in the United States. So Harvard and Duke combined did this really interesting survey in 2015, and they actually asked 5,000 Americans, what do you think the wealth pie looks like distributed by quintile groups, right? 20% groups of population by most wealthy to least wealthy. So Americans think that the 20% wealthiest of Americans control about half of all wealth in society. The next 20% wealthiest control about a third. The second question that was posed to these 5,000 Americans said, well, what would you think it should be like if you had the ability to distribute the wealth pie by quintile groups? And that middle graphic certainly looks more equitable, to be sure. And then the bottom graphic is the true or actual distribution of wealth in a society. And in subsequent to that report, Professor Wolf at NYU did a more granular assessment of the distribution of the wealth pie. So this graphic tells you that the top 1% wealthiest of Americans control over a third of US net worth. And then you add up the top 1%, next 4%, next 5%. So the top 10% wealthiest of Americans control about 78% of all the wealth. And that doesn't leave a lot for the rest of the population. In fact, the bottom 40% control net 0% wealth because the poorest 20% have more debt than equity, which leaves the middle class, which is what we look at the next 20 and the next 20%, essentially a 40% portion of population, the middle class, left with just 12% of the overall wealth pie. The Casey Family Foundation has been tracking net worth by families by race, ethnicity for about 30 years. For all families, right, the net worth has been increasing since the early 1990s. We had the great financial recession of 2007 2008. All families were hurt. We started seeing some recovery for some demographics in the year 2010 2011. But as of 2013, right, for white families in America, the net worth was median was about $140,000. For Latino families, median net worth was about 14,000. For African American families, it was about 11, and for Native American families, it was about 5. So certainly one way to address issues of income inequality that's sort of structural, we can look at a concept called living wage. And certainly the minimum wage in the United States context is $7.25 an hour. And whenever you argue at a legislative level to increase the minimum wage, there's a lot of pushback from business institutions and chambers of commerces. And really what people think is that the minimum wage is perfectly adequate to support young people, teenagers working part-time. They're living at home anyways, and the $725 per hour is in fact just spending money for them. The research tells a much more dramatic story. The average age of a minimum wage earner is 36. 90% are not teens. Almost 40% are 40 years of age or older. More than 50% are women. Almost 30% have to support children on minimum wage. Almost 60% are in fact working full-time at a minimum wage level. When you break down the distribution of minimum wage earners by age and sex, you can see here clearly that certainly male teenagers age 16 to 19 are 10% portion of this segment, and women teenagers age 16 to 19 are a 14% segment, but the largest segment by far is women 25 and older. And when you break down minimum wage earners by education level, it's fair to argue that for those who have not even achieved a high school diploma, it might be challenging to get a high-paying job in our society. And the numbers will certainly show that for those who don't even have a diploma, it's 20%. For those folks who have achieved high school diploma, it's 29% of that pie. But even those individuals who have achieved master's degree, there are 1% portion of the segment. Bachelor's degree earners are even represented at a 6% level. So we have standardized within the Justice program of inviting organizations to use, for US-based organizations, what we call the MIT Living Wage Framework. If you go to MIT, just search up MIT Living Wage Framework, you'll get essentially these kinds of screens. If you were an organization based out of Philadelphia, you will see sort of different family configurations. We are asking organizations to use the 2 adults with 1 adult working as the baseline category. So institutions, organizations in Philadelphia should have an entry minimum wage set at $19.34. And businesses, organizations, institutions in the Phoenix region should have a living wage set at $18.66. So it will vary, of course, by county by county or urban city by urban city. Worker happiness. So as you saw from Gallup earlier on in the presentation, there are high levels of disengagement in the workforce overall. Numbers suggest that it's as high as 70%, has huge implications in terms of lost productivity. In the United States context, it's about $500 billion. High cost of turnover. We know that when we have to replace talented individuals in our organizations, it can be very expensive to replace them, up to 100% of the base salary of the departing employee. Engaged employees outperform their disengaged counterparts, and organizations, companies with high levels of engagement outperform their competitors by a factor of 2 times. So just organizations, just give you a snapshot of what that looks like. So here's a representation of the types of organizations who are choosing to participate in this kind of paradigm and process. Miller Hall is an award-winning design firm headquartered here in Seattle, Washington. Human Scale is a renowned global manufacturer of ergonomic furniture. Beneficial State Bank is a mission-driven community bank. Of course, ASHI's has their trust label, and Chris will certainly be happy to answer questions about their process. Integral Group is a global green building engineering design firm. So the program JUST was launched roughly 2015, and since that time we have 700 organizations from around the world who have registered to understand how it works and how to participate. 90 have finished that process or program and journey and have an official JUST label, which can be seen on our JUST database, and they can use the JUST label for their own internal or external communications. JUST is international in nature. We have JUST program participants in 12 countries. Application is actually process done all online. So you would set up a JUST user account, sub up all your policy information via PDF files. All the web forms are available for you, entry, key, and data. And then here's how the program fee is structured. So depending on the size of your organization, there's associated program fee. The JUST label is good for 24 months after it's published and issued. At that point in time, after 24 months, you would need to renew the submission. You would have to review all your program policies and data. And really the summary statement that we make in terms of why organizations go through a JUST program assessment and disclosure process, we feel it does have social equity impact. You can recruit and retain top talent and students. We feel that by investing in this process around social equity, diversity, and inclusion, it will lead to happier, higher levels of engagement with your workforce. If you already are invested in a DEI effort and practice, this should in fact support that and allow your institution organization to show leadership on social justice when we know that there are high levels of inequity today embedded in our society. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Chris.
All right, thanks, Francis. So let me, the slide's situated here. Okay, yeah, so very interesting stuff. So we've got a few questions come in. Before we get there, as I mentioned before, I wanted to share a little bit of an overview of the linkages between JUST and STARS. Oops, my slides are advancing without me, just a moment.
I don't think you've taken back the presenter handle yet, Chris.
Let's see here, pardon me. Okay, there we go. So before I start on this, I just want to say, once again, you're very welcome to add any questions you have into the questions pane in the control panel, and we'll get to as many as we can after this segment. So it's sort of interesting to compare the two frameworks. I mean, obviously, they're very different in some ways. So as Francis mentioned, JUST is sort of an ingredient label for social justice, whereas STARS is more of a performance-based sustainability standard rating system. However, there is a lot of commonality between them, particularly in regards to human resources, policies, and practices. And you may have picked up on some of that, those of you that are participating in STARS. So I've put together some slides here just to give you a sense of what those linkages look like. So we have here, okay, we have here a comparison of sort of the big overall indicator categories in JUST to the big subcategories in STARS, or kind of impact areas in STARS, to show where linkages sort of exist. And you can see there a lot of it's in sort of human resources areas, some of the innovation credits in STARS, a little bit of public engagement, purchasing, and waste in terms of like hazardous waste as well. So digging in a little bit deeper into each of the categories, and these slides will be available after the fact. As I mentioned, we'll upload them. So I'm not going to go through this in a huge amount of detail, but at least want to touch on some of the areas where there's some synergy between the two programs. So you can see here, the little arrows are just kind of a rough indicator of the ways in which specific STARS credits, the information that you collect for those can contribute to a JUST application, and vice versa when the arrow goes the other way, right? So for example, the double arrow here between the support for underrepresented groups credit in STARS and the non-discrimination indicator in JUST indicates that the information you collect for either of those things can contribute to the other program. And so similarly, if you look at the assessing diversity and equity credit in STARS, you can see that the information you collect for that as a STARS participant, you can use as part of the JUST application process. That doesn't necessarily work in the reverse in that case. The same thing for equity. You can see there's some commonality, particularly in terms of innovation credits in STARS. There's one for pay scale equity. There's another one forthcoming, the next version for full-time faculty employment, which correspond really closely to the indicators in JUST. And again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but just to sort of give you an indication of the linkages here. Obviously, the safety pieces are pretty closely correlated, health and safety and hazardous chemicals, waste management. Also the worker benefit, with the exception of family-friendly policies, which STARS doesn't really get to in the level of depth that JUST does, but some of the other areas have pretty strong linkages. We use the same living wage tool as the JUST program, although we have a different sort of family composition that we use as a benchmark. There's a little bit of a difference there. And then here you can see, with the exception of local control and charitable giving, which STARS doesn't directly address, again, there's a lot of commonality. Local sourcing in JUST is also addressed in STARS through sustainable procurement. Responsible investing is addressed in a STARS credit around sustainable investment. The community service credit in STARS addresses volunteering, as does the JUST indicator, and so on. And I would just say a word about transparency, which I think is important, is that although JUST and STARS address it very differently or in different ways, in kind of a broad sense, both frameworks are transparency platforms, as Francis mentioned, because they require participating organizations to publicly share their information about their initiatives and performance. So, at HE, we learned all this, not just out of our own interest, but because we went through a process of developing a sustainability policy for the organization. And we realized a couple of years ago that although we were doing a lot of good things internally, we felt like we had a lot of good policies and practices in place. We hadn't really brought them together into a cohesive plan or policy, or looked to assess how we were doing. So as part of developing a policy, we started with STARS, of course, and sort of looked at all the credits in STARS and looked at the metrics and tried to see what was applicable to an organization like ASHE. We also looked at the B impact assessment, the program that prospective B corporations go through to assess their performance. And we looked at JUST, and we looked at all these pieces to get a sense of what indicators and metrics were out there and which ones that we should consider adopting for ASHE as an organization. And it was a really interesting process, and we had a pretty big team involved, particularly at the outset, kind of brainstorming and thinking about what this looked like. And as we got a better sense of the similarities and the differences between the three frameworks, we realized at some point that we were already well on the way toward meeting the requirements to earn a JUST label. And so we decided to proceed with that. And we finished our sustainability policy, at least the first version of it, in 2017. And we went through the application process for JUST and earned our JUST label in April of last year. We were the first organization in the higher education sector to do so. And if you're interested in digging in deeper, the sustainability policy and the JUST label are both posted on the ASHE website. So have a look there. So we've got about 10 minutes left, and I want to be sure we have time for questions. So maybe we should go ahead and move there. So I've got one for you here, Francis. How long does the submission process take for JUST, especially for a large organization?
So over the past 3 years, Chris, we found that for larger organizations, the investment in time in total from all participants in the project team looking at just the range we've seen somewhere about 100 hours to 150 hours is the range. And the range differential is variable depending on a lot of how quickly organizations can develop, refine, and get approved any essentially new policy statements. So that's really where a lot of the efforts involved. The actual probably accumulation and finding of the data probably not that challenging in the grand scheme of things. It's usually sitting in some kind of data system, HR system, but it's the policy overall development that really kind of adds to the overall time commitment and involvement.
All right, great. Thanks for that. Let's see here. I have another one. What was the process like for ASHI, and what changes, if any, were made as a result of JUST? Yeah, that's a good question. So we, as I mentioned, we pursued JUST as part of developing our sustainability policy, policy and plan. And for us, that involved creating new policies. In a way, we didn't have a lot of things documented. We had some pieces in place, obviously, from like the HR standpoint. But we learned from JUST that there were some things we could be doing or we should be codifying that we hadn't been. So once we got rolling on that, it was actually pretty simple. The most time-consuming piece, I think, from our perspective, was kind of getting the policy language nailed down and adopting new things. Obviously, it took a little bit of time. The process predominantly involved our HR folks, although we had a kind of a bigger team at the beginning, kind of brainstorming what we wanted to include in the policy. In terms of like the JUST application, it was pretty much a small group of us and mainly HR folks pulling the information together. And the second part of the question about changes that were made, we did end up adopting several new policies based on participating in JUST. We adopted paid leave for community service for employees. We adopted an animal welfare statement, which we hadn't considered before. And the other big thing I know we did was we integrated gender equity and pay equity into some existing policies we had. And it was one of those things we'd sort of assumed that we were doing, but we never put it in writing and kind of integrated into our culture in a formal way. And so in that way, the JUST process really kind of catalyzed that for us. Okay, so another question coming in here. Yeah, is asking about the cost, particularly for a large public university that can have thousands of employees. And the question is there any kind of an educational discount, a sliding scale, a nonprofit discount, anything that to kind of minimize the cost impacts?
And that's a good question. And I think we're willing to entertain some special pricing for higher ed because we would like to establish a presence in colleges and universities. Obviously, ASHI has been the pioneer. It's been very helpful to start this conversation. But we are willing to look on a case-by-case basis. We don't have an established sort of educational discount at the moment. But if there are sort of serious participants within institutions and wanting to explore this, we're willing to look at a preferential pricing relative to what we offer to existing businesses and corporations today.
Okay, great, thanks. Let's see, another question. This is probably for me. Will there be an exemplary practice credit? So STARS includes, as I mentioned, innovation and leadership credits, which are bonus. They're optional credits. Institutions can pursue them to earn extra points. And right now, a JUST label is not recognized specifically in STARS. I think, because there's only, I think, a few institutions pursuing a label in higher education at the moment, it would qualify for an innovation credit if an institution wanted to do that within this current version. Obviously, if there is more take up in higher ed, our governance structure and steering committee would consider adding exemplary practice credit. It might be a good slot for it if that works out. Okay, another interesting question I'm hoping you can shed some light on, Francis. It's about maternity leave and family leave. And is maternity leave and family leave typically available for families who make the choice to adopt rather than reproduce? And the point he's making there is that if we're really concerned about sustainability,
Right.
is it the right thing to do to incentivize reproduction over adoption?
So our experience with working with the initial early adopters of the JUST program, specifically within the family-friendly indicators, that best practices are that in the scenario of whether families are having their kids through birth, through adoption or fostering, all those scenarios are what we would encourage organizations to have practices in place to allow for paid time off in either of those scenarios I just mentioned.
Okay, great, thanks. Probably have time for one more here. Let's see, how would an organization approach the process and what departments are represented?
So with the JUST process, you'll need an executive sponsor. So that's going to be somebody on the senior leadership team. Typically, that would be like a vice president of sustainability, vice president of diversity. Certainly at the higher ed level, they would have to, get obviously a consensus from the leadership team that this is a good step for the organization. So they would sponsor it and get it approved, the various leadership teams. And then there's got to be a key individual from human resources, potentially several, somebody who's very familiar with sort of both policy development and somebody who can actually find out where a lot of the data resides within HR systems. So potentially a couple folks there. And within the campus sustainability team, there might be somebody who overall is working on STARS, would be probably a good candidate. So typically a team of 3 to 4 individuals, but really the HR folks are doing most of the heavy lifting in terms of the development of policies, refinement, and extraction of data.
Okay. All right, thanks, Francis. Okay, so we're almost out of time. Before we conclude, I wanted to let you know about the next webinar we have. It's titled A New Way to Benchmark Your Sustainable Purchasing Program. That'll be next Wednesday, November 7th, starting at 3 p.m. Eastern. This webinar will feature a walk through the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council's benchmarking system with a presentation of early results from that program, as well as a crosswalk with STARS. You can learn more about this webinar and our other professional development offerings on our website, and we hope you'll join us again. A final reminder, if you would, please fill out the post-webinar survey. It will show up on your screen when the webinar ends. As I mentioned before, we take your feedback into account when we plan webinars, so we really appreciate getting your thoughts. Thanks again, Francis, for sharing your expertise with us, and thank you everyone for attending. If you have any additional questions after the webinar for either of us, please email them to education@hg.org. The recording and materials will be available in the Campus Sustainability Hub tomorrow, and you will receive a notification once they've been uploaded. So have a great day and happy Halloween.